I'm going to read a couple of new poems. Recently I've been writing poems about animals. I've always written some animal poems, and the Wapsipinicka Almanac in their next issue is going to have one of my dog poems in it. The Coe Review is going to have a couple of them in it too in their next issue. But this one is just hot off my computer, and it's about one of the little animals in Sri Lanka. As Ron, as perhaps some of you know, I had a Fulbright in Syria for 2 years, and then later another Fulbright in Sri Lanka. And I've started now to write about the little animals in Sri Lanka. I'm especially interested in conserving all of our wildlife. And the first one I want to write about is called the mimina, and it's a mouse deer. And that's what the word means in Sinhala. And it's only about this tall. It's a real deer. It's really from the deer family, but it's just about this big. And so I'm writing about it. It's called Safety. The mimina, or mouse deer, is only 1 foot tall. Its velvety buff brown coat is striped or spotted white, as if embroidered with silk. Is not daring, but cautious. By day hides the jungle where spotlights of sunshine through the canopy freckle foliage-strewn floors. His severed head is not displayed on walls of Sri Lanka's villas, for Miminka has no drama, no startling enormous presence, no horns, no great rat large enough to be candelabrum. The big boasters must have wild boar with its murderous tusks, water buffalo's horns of homicide, slithering leopards' rosette pelts to prove hunters are superior to the hunted. Meanwhile, mouse deer, wary of the mongoose, of dogs and cats that attack it, it's so little that even a cat can get it, slips through jungle shadows, relieved to be boring, nondescript, ordinary, emerges at the edge of the Horton Plain to nibble at the delicate grasses. One about the white pelicans. Mel and I have a little cottage up at Spirit Lake, Iowa. We're both from that part of the state, and we go there in the summer. And there are white pelicans that come through there spring and fall, and most of them go on to Canada. But a few of them stay every year, so we always have a couple hundred white pelicans around the lakes there. And lately there's been a whole group of adolescent pelicans. Pelicans don't mature for about 7 years. And so there's a whole flock of these adolescents that are probably, like 2 or 3 years old, and they hang out just like adolescents do every place. They hang out together, and they've been hanging out on this island in the middle of a small lake called Marble Lake. And actually they act a great deal like teenagers. They're really very funny. Not knowing why. Adolescent white pelicans squawk, rustle, flap their wings, lift off in a ragged spiral at imaginary dangers. What danger on this island in the middle of Marble Lake? They're off to feel the lift of wings under their iridescent wings, because they are born to fly, because they have nothing else to do, because wind and water are their elements, their Bach, their Homer, Shakespeare, and Spielberg. They wheel over the lake, the little farms, the tourist village with their camera eyes. In autumn, something urges them toward the Texas marshes. They follow their appetites and instincts, unlike the small beetles creeping along geometric roads, going toward small boxes, toward lives as narrow or as wide as the pond, as glistening or as gray as the sky. They do not know why. They fly. They fly.
One other thing I wanted to say about Struthers real quick is when the ballots go out for the next Iowa Poet Laureate, write your congressman and, maybe see if you can swing a little bit that way.
At least the fourth.
Anyway, Mary Campbell has been an amazing advocate for peace. Her group meets here frequently. I got to sit in on one recently at Rude Awakening's Coffee House, and her dedication to the promotion of peace and the promotion of goodwill and the promotion of community is synonymous with what Paul Engle wanted, and I thought we needed to hear her voice in our chorus today. So Mary, if you would.
to read is called A Handmade Christmas. It's very poignant. It's about the simpler life that Paul Engle led as a child. And one of the great things about this is that I think his humor really comes through. I can see him, I can actually feel what it must have been like for him as a boy when times were simpler. So, A Handmade Christmas. And Ron, I tried hard. This is, I don't know how many pages this is, but when I read it through the first time, it took me 20 minutes. But I got it down, I think, to 5. So I'll try to read fast, but I want you to be able to understand. A Handmade Christmas. That older Christmas was one we seemed to hold in our hands. After all, our hands seemed to create so much more of it then than now. A few evenings before Christmas, we would sit around big dishpans of popcorn, each child with a long thread and a needle, making strings of white corn to shine from branch to branch of the green tree. We had raised that corn ourselves in the garden behind the house. I had spent some hot mornings hoeing between the hills of corn, so that my feelings towards it were a little bit mixed. I always seemed to jab the kernels a lot harder than my sisters, so that the needle would break through and punch my skin. It was a miniature blood sacrifice. There were also popcorn balls to be made just the size of baseballs, that sticky stuff shaped lovingly in our hands. The whole kitchen reeked of the crisp smell of corn and the sweet smell of hot syrup, and so did we. We would wrap oval, pointed butternuts from a grove on the farm where my mother had been born in sheets of tin foil, tying them with strings so that they could be hung from the tree to have a second and more glittering life back again in midair. Of course, the greatest tree was the tall one at church on Christmas Eve, with its long candles wavering in the drafty air, and a man standing at one side with a 10-foot pole, which had a wet sponge tied on the end, ready to douse any fires that started. I feared that, along with the other children, we prayed as much for a really menacing fire to start as we did for the Christ child. Once I was wrapped smartly on the hand with that rod for trying to get an extra sack of candy passed out at the end of the service. There was always a church play on Christmas Eve, given at great cost to bed sheets and tempers. I was usually an anonymous shepherd with instructions to keep my grating voice low so as not to interfere with those who could sing. However, the shepherds carried crooks, which we used with deadly effect to trip the ankles of the splendid characters who had been the saintly Joseph and the wise man just a few minutes before. The star that led the wise men across the desert traveled on a wire across the tiny stage and often stuck halfway across, long before it reached the corner, which was the barn where Joseph and Mary and the Christ child lay. One of the shepherds would then lift his crook to the starry heavens and shove that wayward star over where it belonged, sometimes bringing down the skies themselves. Many of the gifts were made right in the family. My older brother usually had some wooden object out of his manual training class, a stool, a rack for the kitchen wall, while my sisters were busy with elaborately scrolled initials in the corners of handkerchiefs or with aprons on which whole gardens of flowers were appliqued. I was too small to make anything except mischief, but my ambition was to whittle as well as my uncle on the farm, who could make a whistle which would really blow, carve little animals out of soft pine, or tiny rifle with a peep sight. Nevertheless, I tried, and one year I actually managed to chip and cut and beat a darning egg from a chunk of wood, sanding its awkward corners down, rubbing wax in it until it was literally a handmade and hand-polished thing, wrapped in the fanciest paper I could find, and presented to my mother as if it had been a glittering diamond. It was our mother, of course, who made the most, something for every one of